January 1944. High above central Germany, the air is thin and brittle with cold. At 25,000 feet, condensation trails carve white scars across a pale winter sky. The engines of American bombers beat steadily, a mechanical pulse echoing through aluminum frames and oxygen masks. Below them, the land is muted. Fields, rivers, cities reduced to frozen geometry. Inside a German fighter cockpit, a pilot scans the horizon. He has done this before, many times. The routine is familiar. Bombers arrive, escorts turn back. The Reich's fighters strike where the Americans are weakest, alone, slow, exposed. It has worked for months. But today, something is wrong. The escorts are still there. Slim silhouettes hold formation beside the bombers far deeper than expected. They do not peel away. They do not hesitate. They stay, long after they should have turned back toward the channel. For the first time, German pilots realize the rules of the air war may have changed. Not with a new strategy announced over radio, not with a declaration from Berlin or Washington, but with a fighter they had dismissed, now flying calmly, relentlessly, all the way to the heart of Germany. And as the bombers press on, one question begins to surface in Luftwaffe cockpits across the Reich. How far can these escorts really go? By the beginning of 1943, the air war over Europe had settled into a brutal pattern. The United States Army Air Forces believed in daylight precision bombing. It was a doctrine built on confidence in formation flying, in defensive firepower, and in the idea that tightly grouped heavy bombers could protect themselves. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were armed with multiple machine guns, layered fields of fire, and crews trained to fight as much as bomb. The theory was simple. Bombers would fly in dense formations, their overlapping guns forming a defensive wall. Fighters, it was believed, would be unable to penetrate without suffering unacceptable losses. Accuracy would come from daylight visibility. Industry would be destroyed systematically. The war would be shortened from the air. Reality arrived quickly. German airspace was not empty sky. It was a layered defense system refined since 1939. Radar stations along the coast provided early warning. Fighter control centers tracked formations across hundreds of miles. Anti-aircraft guns, flak, ringed major cities and industrial targets, and waiting on the ground were experienced fighter pilots, many of them veterans of Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. When American bombers crossed into occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe did not meet them all at once. German commanders preferred staged attacks. Fighters climbed ahead of the bomber streams, attacking from head-on angles where defensive guns were weakest. Others struck from above, diving through formations at high speed. Still others waited, conserving fuel and aircraft, striking again as damaged bombers fell behind. And then there was the range problem. American escort fighters could not stay with the bombers for long. Early in the war, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings provided protection only to the edge of their fuel limits. Over France, Belgium, or Western Germany, they turned back. Beyond that point, the bombers were alone. The Luftwaffe knew this boundary well. German pilots timed their attacks to begin just as the escorts disappeared. The bombers' defensive guns were formidable, but not invulnerable. Isolated aircraft were singled out. Engines burned. Wings broke away. Crews bailed out, or did not. The losses mounted steadily through 1942 and early 1943. Missions were costly, but survivable, until the targets moved deeper. In August 1943, the United States committed to a series of raids against German ball-bearing factories, critical components for engines, vehicles, and weapons. The targets lay far inside the Reich. The missions would test the limits of daylight bombing. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids proved catastrophic. On August 17, 1943, two bomber forces struck deep into Germany. Of the 376 aircraft dispatched, 60 were destroyed. Hundreds more were damaged. Crews were killed, wounded, or captured. The factories were hit, but German production recovered faster than expected. Then came October 14, 1943, later known as Black Thursday. Again, bombers flew toward Schweinfurt. Again, they went beyond Escort range, and again, the Luftwaffe waited. German fighters attacked in waves, pressing home attacks despite losses. By the end of the day, 60 B-17s had been shot down. Over 600 airmen were missing or killed. For the men who survived, the message was unmistakable. Daylight bombing without long-range escort was unsustainable. Morale suffered. Crews calculated odds. Some missions showed loss rates exceeding 10%. At those numbers, few airmen could expect to complete a full tour of duty. Inside the USAAF, the doctrine was no longer theoretical. It was being measured in burning wreckage and empty bunks. Yet abandoning daylight bombing was not an option. Night bombing belonged to the Royal Air Force, already paying its own price over German cities. The Americans believed precision required sunlight. What they lacked was not belief, but reach. Some solution had to bridge the gap between the Channel Coast and the industrial heart of Germany. Until that gap was closed, the Luftwaffe would continue to fight on its own terms. And German pilots, confident and aggressive, believed they still understood exactly how the air war worked. They did not yet know that a quiet change was already taking shape, one that would redraw the map of escort range entirely. The aircraft that would change the balance of the air war did not arrive with fanfare. When the North American P-51 Mustang first appeared in 1941, it was not seen as a breakthrough. It was a solution to a British requirement, an urgently needed fighter that could be produced quickly. North American aviation designed it in remarkable time, moving from concept to first flight in just over 4 months. Its airframe was clean, aerodynamic, and efficient, but its engine told a different story. Early Mustangs were powered by the Allison V1710. At low and medium altitudes, the aircraft performed well. It was fast, stable, and had excellent range. The Royal Air Force used it primarily for reconnaissance and ground attack. At higher altitudes, where bomber combat took place, the Allison engines struggled. Performance dropped, climb rates suffered. The aircraft could not compete with frontline German fighters above 20,000 feet. To many observers, the Mustang was simply another competent but unremarkable design. In Germany, it barely registered. Luftwaffe intelligence focused on known threats: the P-47 Thunderbolt with its heavy armament, the twin-engine P-38 Lightning with its distinctive silhouette. These were aircraft German pilots had fought and learned to counter. They were formidable but predictable. Most importantly, they did not follow the bombers all the way in. The Mustang, by contrast, was not yet flying deep escort missions. When it did appear, it was often misidentified or dismissed as a minor type. German pilots noted its slim wings and unfamiliar shape, but saw nothing to suggest it would alter the strategic equation. That changed when the engine changed. British test pilots recognized that the Mustang's airframe had untapped potential. When fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, licensed in the United States as the Packard 1650, the transformation was immediate. High-altitude performance surged, speed increased dramatically, climb rates improved. Most importantly, fuel efficiency remained exceptional. The Mustang could now do what no American fighter had done before. It could fly far, very far. With drop tanks, the P-51's combat radius extended beyond 600 miles. It could escort bombers deep into Germany and stay with them. Not to the edge of the Reich, not halfway to the target, but all the way there and back. Still, the aircraft entered service quietly. In late 1943, the first P-51B and C models began reaching USAAF units in England. Pilots trained, ground crews adapted, tactical doctrine lagged behind technology. Initially, Mustangs were used conservatively. Close escort, tight formation, little independent action. German pilots noticed them more frequently now, but still misunderstood what they were seeing. Early encounters did not immediately reveal the Mustang's full threat. Luftwaffe veterans, flying Bf-109s and Fw-190s, found they could match it in certain conditions. At times, they outclimbed it. At others, they could dive away. In limited engagements, the Mustang did not seem invincible. What German pilots did not see was the cumulative effect. Mustangs did not turn back. They followed bombers across central Germany. They waited above airfields. They loitered near assembly points. They returned on the withdrawal leg when damaged aircraft were most vulnerable. By early 1944, the psychological boundary, the invisible line where American escorts had always disappeared, was gone. German fighter controllers began reporting something unprecedented: escort fighters still present over targets once considered safely beyond Allied reach. At first, these reports were treated as anomalies, weather, navigation errors, isolated units, but the pattern repeated, and with each mission, the Mustang's presence grew more familiar and more troubling. What had once been a predictable fight was becoming uncertain, and uncertainty in air combat was deadly. As winter tightened its grip on Europe, a new phase of the air war was approaching, one in which German pilots would no longer choose when and where to fight. Instead, they would be hunted. For much of the war, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had lived with a sense of control. They did not command the skies, but they understood them. Interceptions followed patterns. Bombers appeared at predictable times, flew predictable routes, and, crucially, lost their protection beyond a known distance. German pilots planned around that moment. Fuel loads were calculated, attack altitudes chosen. The escorts would leave, and the hunt would begin. The arrival of the P-51 disrupted that rhythm. At first, it was subtle. Escorts stayed longer than expected. A formation that should have been alone was not. Pilots climbing to attack suddenly found fighters already above them. Engagements began earlier and lasted longer. Fuel margins shrank. What unsettled German pilots most was not the Mustang's speed or armament, but its persistence. Unlike earlier escorts, the P-51 did not merely shield bombers. It pressed into the airspace where German fighters assembled. It followed them after disengagement. It appeared on the return leg when ammunition was low and aircraft were damaged. Experienced pilots sensed the change immediately. The sky no longer belonged to the defender between attacks. Every climb risked interception. Every dive risked pursuit. Younger pilots, rushed through training as losses mounted, had no such instincts to rely on. They entered combat against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at all times. Confidence eroded mission by mission. The Luftwaffe had built its tactics around short, violent engagements near home bases. The Mustangs stretched those engagements until they became exhausting contests of endurance, something German pilots, constrained by fuel and attrition, could not afford. And slowly, the hunters began to feel hunted. For American bomber crews, survival had once depended on timing. They watched the escort fighters peel away. They noted the moment carefully. Beyond it lay fear, silence, and the expectation of attack. Crews tightened formations, gunners scanned the sky relentlessly. Some men prayed, others counted minutes. Then the Mustangs stayed. At first, it was almost disorienting. Fighters still visible off the wings deep into Germany, on the way in, over the target, on the way out. For crews accustomed to isolation, the psychological effect was profound. The presence of escorts changed behavior. Formations held together longer. Damaged aircraft had a better chance of staying aloft. German attacks were disrupted earlier, often before they could fully organize. Crews began to notice something else. German fighters were less aggressive. Attacks were broken off. Head-on passes were fewer. Instead of pressing through defensive fire, enemy aircraft maneuvered defensively themselves. Loss rates dropped. It did not make missions safe. Bombers were still hit. Men were still killed. But the sense of inevitability, of being sacrificed beyond escort range, began to fade. For the first time, bomber crews felt that someone was fighting alongside them, not merely delivering them to the edge of danger. That shift mattered, because morale was as much a weapon as machine guns, and the Mustang was restoring something the USAAF had been losing steadily since 1943: belief. The Mustang's impact was not the result of a single innovation, but of balance. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag. Its Merlin engine delivered power efficiently at high altitude. Its internal fuel capacity, combined with drop tanks, allowed unprecedented range, and its armament, 6.5 caliber machine guns, was lethal without compromising performance. But technology alone did not explain its effectiveness. The P-51 was forgiving to fly, stable at speed, responsive in combat. It allowed pilots to focus on tactics rather than survival. This mattered in prolonged engagements far from base. German fighters, optimized for defense near home bases, sacrificed endurance for performance. The Mustang did not. Every design choice reinforced a simple truth: this aircraft was built to stay. In staying, changed everything. As the Mustang's presence became constant rather than occasional, the air war began to shift from a series of isolated clashes into a continuous contest across hundreds of miles, one that Germany was not prepared to fight.
The Mustang's true impact was unlocked by a change in leadership. In January 1944, General James H. Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force. He inherited a force that had suffered heavily but learned relentlessly. Doolittle understood that escort fighters were not meant to merely shield bombers. They were meant to destroy the enemy's ability to fight. Under previous doctrine, fighters were tethered to bomber formations. Close escort was prioritized. Independent action was discouraged. The goal was protection, not dominance. Doolittle reversed that logic. He authorized fighter pilots to range ahead of the bomber streams, to engage German fighters wherever they could be found. Airfields, assembly points, climb corridors, anywhere the Luftwaffe operated became legitimate hunting ground. The Mustang made this doctrine possible. Its range allowed fighters to sweep far ahead and still return. Its performance allowed pilots to choose when to engage. Escort was no longer passive. It became aggressive, deliberate, and destructive. German pilots now faced an enemy that attacked before bombers even appeared. The psychological impact was immediate. Luftwaffe units began launching under pressure, already engaged, already losing aircraft. Bomber formations encountered fewer coordinated attacks, not because German pilots lacked courage, but because they were being broken up before they could organize. Air superiority was no longer something achieved over a target. It was something established across an entire day's operations, and the Mustang was the instrument that allowed that shift to happen. From the ground, the situation looked increasingly grim. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe faced shortages on every front. Fuel was rationed, training hours were cut, replacement pilots arrived with fewer than half the flight time their predecessors had received. The appearance of long-range escorts compounded every problem. Interception required climbing to altitude, a fuel-intensive process. Fighters now burned precious fuel merely reaching the bombers, only to find escorts already waiting. Losses mounted faster than replacements could arrive. German commanders recognized the danger. Reports warned that escort fighters were destroying experienced pilots at unsustainable rates, but there was no immediate solution. New aircraft designs were delayed. Jet technology was not yet operational in meaningful numbers. Defensive tactics refined over years were becoming obsolete almost overnight. The Luftwaffe had been designed to fight short, sharp battles near home. The Mustang forced it into a war of attrition it could not win. Each lost pilot represented not just an aircraft destroyed, but years of training erased, and there were no reserves left. The air war was not only about machines and tactics, it was about fear. For years, fear had belonged primarily to the bomber crews, waiting, exposed beyond escort range. Now it began to shift. German pilots took off knowing they might be intercepted before even seeing the bombers. Airfields were attacked, return routes were no longer safe. Survival depended less on skill and more on chance. The sense of inevitability moved with the Mustang. This shift mattered because morale shapes outcomes long before battles are decided. As confidence drained from the Luftwaffe, effectiveness followed. Engagements became hesitant, mistakes increased, losses accelerated. By early 1944, the air war had reached a tipping point. The escorts were no longer reacting, they were dictating the fight. And the moment when this change became undeniable was approaching, over the skies of Germany's most guarded airspace.
By February 1944, the air war entered its most decisive phase. The skies over Germany no longer followed the old logic of approach, strike, and withdrawal. Instead, they became contested from the moment American aircraft lifted off from England until the last engines shut down hours later. The symbol of that change was not a single battle, but a destination long thought unreachable under Escort: Berlin. For years, the German capital had been a psychological boundary as much as a geographic one. It lay deep within the Reich, protected by dense flak belts and fighter bases. American daylight bombers had reached it before, but only at staggering cost, and never with continuous fighter protection. That changed in early 1944. On March 4th, hundreds of B-17s and B-24s formed up over England and turned east. Among them flew P-51 Mustangs, their drop tanks glinting faintly in the morning light. As the formation crossed the German border, Luftwaffe controllers watched their radar screens carefully, waiting for the escorts to disappear. They did not. The Mustangs stayed with the bombers as they pushed toward the capital. They climbed ahead of the formations. They spread out along likely interception routes. They engaged German fighters before coordinated attacks could be assembled. When the bombers reached Berlin, American fighters were still overhead. For German pilots, the realization was immediate and deeply unsettling. The one area where the bombers had always been vulnerable, the deep interior, was no longer beyond Allied reach. Interceptors climbing from bases around the capital found themselves facing fresh escorts at altitude, not tired fighters turning for home. Combat erupted across a wide front. Mustangs met Bf-109s and Fw-190s in fast, violent engagements. The battles did not resemble earlier escort fights. There was no single defensive ring around the bombers. Instead, the sky was fractured into dozens of separate duels, each fought on terms increasingly dictated by the Americans. Losses mounted quickly. German units reported aircraft destroyed before reaching firing position. Others were damaged and forced to disengage early. Some pilots never reached the bombers at all. The bombers still faced flak, crews were still killed, but the coordinated fighter assaults that had once shredded formations were absent. For the first time, Berlin was bombed in daylight with full escort coverage. The significance went far beyond physical damage. It meant the Luftwaffe could no longer protect even its most symbolic targets from sustained, escorted attack. It meant that every factory, every rail yard, every fuel depot was now exposed to repeated daylight bombing with reduced American losses. And it meant that German pilots, already stretched thin, were being forced into fights they could not avoid and could not win in the long run. What followed was not a single decisive battle, but a cascade. A moment when attrition accelerated beyond recovery. And as winter turned toward spring, the pressure only intensified. The breaking point came not in a single day, but in a sustained offensive designed to force a decision. In late February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. Its objective was clear: destroy Germany's aircraft industry and, just as critically, its fighter force. Bombing targets included aircraft factories, engine plants, and airframe assembly centers across the Reich. But the true battlefield was the sky. For 6 consecutive days, American bombers flew deep into Germany in massive numbers. And with them flew escorts, thousands of fighters, the majority of them P-51 Mustangs. They did not simply accompany the bombers, they roamed. Mustangs swept ahead of formations, attacked airfields, intercepted fighters as they climbed, and pursued damaged aircraft relentlessly. German pilots were forced to launch again and again, often with little rest, insufficient fuel, and minimal coordination. Losses became catastrophic. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots, men who had survived years of combat, were shot down in growing numbers. These were not easily replaced. Training pipelines were already strained, fuel shortages limited flight hours. New pilots entered combat with minimal preparation, facing an enemy that was faster, more numerous, and tactically aggressive. The imbalance was stark. American fighter pilots could disengage at will, dive away, regroup in return. German pilots, defending fixed points, had no such flexibility. Each sortie was a commitment. Each loss was permanent. By the end of Big Week, German aircraft production had suffered, but it would partially recover. The fighter pilot corps would not. The Luftwaffe's core strength, its experienced aviators, had been shattered. From that point forward, German fighter units were increasingly reactive rather than proactive. Interceptions were fragmented, attacks were rushed, coordination broke down. Mustangs encountered fewer organized defenses and more isolated, desperate opponents. By spring 1944, Allied fighters no longer merely escorted bombers, they dominated the airspace above them. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Bomber losses dropped sharply, mission frequency increased, targets could be revisited repeatedly. Rail networks, fuel plants, and industrial centers were hit with growing precision. And when Allied armies prepared to cross the Channel, they did so under skies that the Luftwaffe could no longer contest effectively. The moment German pilots had dismissed the Mustang as just another escort fighter, was gone. In its place stood an uncomfortable truth: the air war over Germany had been decided. What remained was to measure the damage and understand what that decision would mean for the rest of the war. The effects of the Mustang's arrival were felt almost immediately. By the spring of 1944, the statistical shape of the air war had changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. American bomber loss rates, once routinely measured in double digits for deep penetration missions, fell sharply. Losses still occurred, but no longer at levels that threatened the survival of the daylight bombing campaign itself. For the Luftwaffe, the numbers told a far grimmer story. Between January and May 1944, German fighter units suffered losses they could not replace. Thousands of pilots were killed, wounded, or captured. Crucially, these were not inexperienced recruits, but seasoned veterans, flight leaders, instructors, men who carried institutional knowledge earned over years of combat. Aircraft production continued, but aircraft without trained pilots were meaningless. Fuel shortages worsened. Allied bombing increasingly targeted synthetic fuel plants, compounding the crisis. Training hours were slashed. New pilots arrived at frontline units with alarmingly little flight time, sometimes fewer than 100 hours. They faced Mustangs flown by pilots who trained continuously, rotated out of combat, and benefited from overwhelming logistical support. The psychological shift became evident in combat reports. German pilots avoided prolonged engagements. Interceptions were delayed or aborted. Some units reported refusing to engage when escort strength appeared overwhelming. Others suffered near-total losses in single missions.
American fighter pilots, by contrast, grew more confident and more aggressive. With air superiority increasingly assured, they pressed attacks lower and deeper, strafing airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, and disrupting operations before bombers even arrived. By May 1944, Allied air forces had achieved something unprecedented over Germany: sustained dominance. This dominance reshaped every aspect of the war effort. Bombing accuracy improved as formations held together. Missions increased in frequency. German industry was denied time to recover between attacks. And, perhaps most decisively, the Luftwaffe, once the sharp edge of Germany's military power, had been reduced to a defensive force struggling to survive. The sky was no longer contested in the way it had been in 1943. It was controlled, and that control would soon be used to shape events far beyond the air war itself. By the summer of 1944, the consequences of air superiority reached far beyond bomber formations. The collapse of effective German air defense reshaped the battlefield across Europe. With the Luftwaffe unable to challenge Allied aircraft in meaningful numbers, the skies over occupied territory belonged to the Allies almost entirely. This dominance proved decisive in the lead-up to Operation Overlord. In the months before D-Day, Allied aircraft systematically attacked rail lines, bridges, and transportation hubs across France and Western Germany. Fighter bombers and escort fighters operated with increasing freedom, striking targets of opportunity and disrupting German troop movements. The Luftwaffe's inability to contest these attacks left ground forces exposed and isolated. On June 6, 1944, Allied troops landed in Normandy under skies largely free of enemy aircraft. German air units attempted to respond, but the imbalance was overwhelming. Mustangs and other Allied fighters patrolled constantly, intercepting sorties before they could reach the beaches. What German aircraft did appear were often quickly engaged or driven off. The strategic bombing campaign also intensified. With escorts able to accompany bombers to any target in Germany, the Allies focused relentlessly on fuel production. Synthetic fuel plants, oil refineries, and transportation networks were struck repeatedly. Output fell sharply. Armored units, aircraft, and vehicles were starved of fuel. Even when aircraft were available, they often could not fly. The Mustang's role in this phase was not always visible, but it was essential. Without long-range escort, the bombing campaign would have remained limited. With it, German industry was subjected to sustained pressure it could not escape. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel or pilots. Training programs collapsed. Veteran leadership was gone. Attempts to introduce advanced aircraft, including jets, came too late and in too few numbers to reverse the situation. The dismissal of the Mustang in its early encounters now appeared catastrophic. What had seemed like just another escort fighter had become the enabler of Allied air supremacy, not through invincibility, but through endurance, flexibility, and the ability to stay where it mattered most. As the war ground toward its conclusion, the results of that shift were visible everywhere, in destroyed factories, immobilized armies, and skies that grew steadily quieter. Quiet because the fight for control had already been decided, and in that quiet, history would find its meaning. By the winter of 1944, the skies over Germany were quieter, but not peaceful. They were silent because control had been established, not because danger had vanished. The P-51 Mustang had reshaped the air war through a simple, relentless truth. Reach and persistence matter as much as firepower. It had turned a predictable battlefield into one where the defender was constantly hunted, where experience counted for less than endurance, and where strategy collided with reality. The lesson was stark. Underestimation carries consequences. German pilots, confident in their dominance, had dismissed the Mustang as just another fighter.
By the time they understood its capabilities, the battle had already shifted irrevocably. Technology alone did not win the war, but the combination of innovation, doctrine, and human determination did. For bomber crews, the Mustang represented hope and survival. For fighter pilots, it represented opportunity and control. For the war itself, it marked a turning point, the destruction of the Luftwaffe's core, the opening of Germany's industrial heart to unrelenting assault, and the acceleration of the Allied path to victory. And in the end, the Mustang's legacy was not only in the aircraft lost or pilots killed, but in a profound lesson about war itself. Sometimes the smallest advantage, an engine, a wing, a doctrine, can reach further than anyone expects, crossing boundaries that once seemed unassailable. Its presence over Berlin was more than tactical, it was symbolic. The future of the sky and of the war had changed forever.